Geraldine, I always appreciate you being willing to talk with me about matters liturgical. I always feel you have one of the better senses of the liturgical year and the rhythms of life of anybody I know, and so I naturally turn to you when I want to talk about the great feasts of the church year. And the one I'd like to talk about today is the Feast of Epiphany. And the Feast of Epiphany is, again, a part of our celebration of the incarnation, the manifestation of God in the world. The very word suggests that, epiphany, manifestation. I think we even use that in common parlance sometime. This is an epiphany, meaning a rather striking manifestation of something. And so that is what the major idea of the feast is. I think in the Eastern Church it becomes the major feast of incarnation rather than Christmas. I think that there was a time in the Eastern calendar was being worked out where it was connected again in with the winter solstice because the calendar was off base a bit, and I think that Epiphany in the East was another way of celebrating the light triumphing over the darkness, the fact that the days were getting longer again, and it had that notion of light connected with it. And of course, so the Feast of the Epiphany then it brings to our mind, and as we do it in the liturgy, talking about the visit of the wise men or the astrologers from the East who come to visit Christ, a beautiful and well-known story. And we might just try to stay with that for a minute and see if we can start to tease out some of the meaning connected with this Feast of Epiphany along that line. You want to comment at all on that general introduction there about Epiphany and this reading the story of the wise men and so on?
Well, I think of Epiphany, as you mentioned, the word manifestation, and sometimes I think of those that, in a certain sense, there are those personal epiphanies that we have. Some, again, epiphany meaning light or enlightenment or revelation, and that maybe that's kind of that connection with star and the idea of light and being led. But that also, that we can attach that word epiphany, that Christ is the epiphany of God, and that somehow that touches our world. So Epiphany is a great celebration. I think I too, in terms of times past, have celebrated it in different ways. In some early on convent days, we used to celebrate it as Little Christmas. So it was, I think we probably got that from some of the earlier on traditions, and that was always kind of nice because it was sort of school had then started already and we were back in the routine, and it really seemed like Christmas was over, but here was one more time to kind of capture that essence of, the Christmas story. And I think even to the point sometimes that I think I'm probably reflecting on childhood practices, or at least early on convent, we'd never pull out the Three Kings for the Christmas crib until this feast because it somehow or other didn't fit in. So the gospel then, I guess as an adult though, what I've come to appreciate particularly, I notice in Matthew's gospel, he refers to them as wise men. I'm sure there were some wise women there with him too, don't you? Again, they didn't get mentioned, but I just know that they were there.
They came along on the trip today, or maybe they initiated it. Maybe they were the ones who saw the star first.
I bet, and they probably for some reason told them in and they said, let's go or something. But anyway, another translation, though, suggests that they were astrologers, and I really like that because that puts miracles within the context, or God's manifestation within the context of ordinary reach, that in the very nature of their profession, it was not too terribly unordinary for them to notice that something was different about this star. It was, as I say, within the nature of their profession. So there was something intriguing about that, and just that image of, because they were astrologers, and this idea of a star, that it was common for them to watch the stars, to observe the planetary systems, to the formations, to study them. So the context there being that right within our own ordinary whatever we are, that God is always manifesting himself, herself to us, and that that's really an exciting theme for me.
You brought out early on in your comments about the personal epiphanies. That's probably one way to get into this whole understanding of the Feast of the Epiphany. I suppose part of the problem would be whether we really notice those personal epiphanies or not, that maybe there's manifestations of the presence of the Lord that we're not in tune with. I often think of this feast as being one that calls us to be more alert and more aware, to walk upright and open our eyes and try to see what's happening. It's another feast of light. It's a carrying on, as you said, of the Christmas theme of the triumph of light over darkness. In fact, I notice in the first reading for the Feast of the Epiphany is from Isaiah 60, which has that whole mood and feeling. Rise up in splendor, Jerusalem. Your light has come. The glory of the Lord shines upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick clouds cover the peoples. But upon you, it seems a very personal address. The Lord shines, and over you appears His glory. So it has that marvelous sense of, I think, calling us to rise up and to try to be more aware of those personal epiphanies. I like that phrase that you used. And very often they are extremely unique and personal. I mean, what you see about life isn't what I see, and we might have a similar encounter or see the same movie or something and watch the same television program, and maybe for you it does become an epiphany and not for me. And part of that, I suppose, has to do with personality and character and background and needs at the moment, but also one factor in it, I think, is fundamental openness and whether we're on alert for those kinds of messages from the Lord.
It reminds me that when you write your reflections articles, that those seem to be personal epiphanies that you share with us, that you many times can capture a lot of meaning out of a given event, particularly some of those that, stick out in my mind are, when you wrote on the Challenger and the disaster there, or you write about baseball or some of the common experiences that we all know. So, and I do think that the personal epiphanies are different for each of us for the situations and conditions that you mentioned. But again, the importance, just that we know that they are there. And I like your idea, which I didn't think of, and that was that, it's a feast of sort of calling us to be alert. And given that the new year has just begun and the months are kind of, I hear people often talk about, myself included, January, February, March, it's kind of a new, fresh beginning to the beginning of a year to kind of, stand up and take notice. And it just sort of throws a nuance to another way of beginning something. So I like that idea also.
Did you ever have in your traditions a big thing about the three kings?
Ah, yes.
Yes, that's part of your background and heritage too, isn't it?
Right. A home blessing attached to the idea of blessing the home. And I remember as a child that when we went to church on the Feast of Three Kings, it was part of the custom to pass out in an envelope some chalk that was blessed and some incense. And then we would go home and we would take in, we ourselves, and sort of I think that's a contemporary notion right now of the domestic church, but at home and in family, that we ourselves would bless our own home. And a part of that ritual was to mark on the doorways, take the chalk that was blessed, and to mark on the doorways the letters 19, and then a cross, and then the initial C, and another cross, and an initial M, and another cross, and an initial B, another cross, and then the year. And the idea was that you were putting the year down, and the crosses in between represented the 4 seasons, and then the 3 letters C, M, and B represented by way of what tradition tells us was the name of the 3 kings. So
which were, Geraldine?
Casper, Melchior, and Balthazar.
Yes, the famous 3 kings.
But my favorite is the 4th king that we don't hear too much about. But anyway, yes, there is.
The woman king, the queen that came along, the woman astrologer.
The name was Artaban. I don't know if it was a he or she.
Well, it sounds like it could be feminine. But anyway, so this was part of the family custom. I like the way you linked that up with, an idea of the domestic church. I mean, I'm not so sure how much of the liturgy ever flowed back into the home setting. If we think of our Jewish friends, they've always had a much stronger sense of that, of celebrating the Passover meal at home and the liturgy going on there, and the father playing a prominent role, and the youngest son asking the question about why is this night significant, and so on. There was a sense of home liturgy, thus sanctifying the whole of life, especially family life. And it would seem important that we find our ways to do that, to make that linkage between liturgy and life. I don't really know how people do that today. I suppose one way would be to discuss the liturgy or the homily or the readings in the car on the way home, or if people go out to brunch after Mass or something, to carry it on. I suppose the Advent wreath has been a way of doing that for some people. I really don't know if many people do that anymore. I think there was a time a number of years ago when there was a lot of effort to Christianize the Advent season at home, in which the Advent wreath played a major role, the lighting of the candles at home. Another effort along that line. And maybe we've lost that, or maybe it's hard to know how to do that in the modern context. I'm not really sure.
Well, in whatever way it happens, it's not really a formal thing that you do in your home, and it's a rather easy thing, but I take great delight that even, at this point in time, that there are times that I will go and visit people's homes, and I have seen that in their home. I remember going to an office once.
Seeing what?
The
markings?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah, above
People
the door.
People still do it?
Yes, and I take rather great delight in that. I guess I already... my origins are of Polish background, and I guess I always thought that was a Polish custom, but I notice more and more in our general literature in regard to liturgy that is a recommended practice. So I think basically it's an expression of faith, and I sort of take delight in that.
It is an expression of faith, for sure, and an important element of the faith, which I keep insisting on, is somehow liturgy has to get connected in with everyday life. I mean, if we go to the church and celebrate the great feasts during Advent and Christmas and New Year's and Epiphany, and it just remains in the church, well, it doesn't really carry its full function then. The whole idea is that the liturgy is supposed to illumine life, that it's supposed to tell us something about what's happening always and everywhere in our world. The liturgy is supposed to create a sacred sense of things and attune us and make us more alert so that we're able to find the presence of the Lord in our ordinary activities. That's the function of it, and it's not just an obligation, well, we go there and get it done with and forget it and leave it there and leave the religion in the sanctuary, but to carry it with us. And that's our continuing problem for all of us, isn't it? Those beautiful things we say in church and hear, and the marvelous message given to us by the Scripture readings, reminders of God's love for us, all He's done, and the great stories that illumine life, like the story of the wise men from the East. All of that is beautiful, but it has its deeper meaning only if it perdures somehow. We carry it in our hearts, and we are able, in one way or another, put it into practice. So the old custom, as you're talking about, of using the chalk and marking the doorway is an important part of that. Incidentally, what did you do with the incense? You said they gave you incense and chalk.
Oh, that's right. We would burn the incense, and that incense would burn as part of our prayer, that using incense as it's traditionally used. I don't know if there was a connection between the incense and prayer and kind of the three gifts that tradition...
I would guess that is the case,
right.
Yeah. I would guess that.
We didn't get any, I know we didn't get any gold or frankincense or myrrh. We got the
myrrh
incense.
Or gold went
right.
along with
right.
this, yeah. Well, Geraldine, I'm thinking that in this story, an interesting part of it is the idea of the star. And, what we are to make out of all of that. I mean, there's been a lot of historical efforts to uncover the stars. As you pointed out, the ancients had great interest in the skies and the stars and had marvelous understandings very often. You think of places like Stonehenge and other places around the world where they seem to have a very enlightened view of the movements of the heavenly bodies. And so there's been a lot of efforts to figure out what it was, Halley's Comet and all of that. But I suppose we learn more if we see it symbolically and let it function like that. And what is it telling us about life and so on. I just take one stab at it, and that is it could open up the whole question of the way creation reveals God to us. Paul had that idea that revelation doesn't just come through Christ, but it comes through the natural world, through the created world. And maybe Epiphany becomes a chance to recover part of that. After all, we have these wise men and perhaps others with them who understood something of this, and they're able to see the star, and they follow it. They let nature lead them in some way. They're responsive to the call of creation. And so maybe we could begin to reflect a little bit on the meaning of the star along that line.
Well, I like that idea of creation, and being a Franciscan, I think you're well aware, and I think most people are, that Francis was one who was very much in tune with creation, and there is a notion that comes out of Franciscan thought that talks about Francis as a person with an idea of what was called cosmic fraternity. and the word fraternity not being, it's a problematic word in our culture. It isn't throughout the world for Franciscans, but the idea is that because Jesus is our brother, that we are in relationship with one another as people, but not just human beings, but all of creation. So many times, when we talk about Francis and we talk about Brother Sun and Sister Moon and Sister Star, that's that whole part of being related. It says something about the quality of relationships, and so I find that very important, that we would reflect on creation itself, whether that be nature or humanity, but that there is a connectedness in all of it, which basically, for me, I think is a manifestation, can be part of that personal epiphany. So while we're talking about the star, I think the star is symbolic of all of creation, and creation being a way to point to God as creator, and a way to get in touch with, then again, more of the revelation of who God is for us.
In a way, too, we could play that out in terms of human solidarity, because we live on this one Earth, spaceship Earth, and we have the creation in common, that God has given us the blessings of this earth, this strange combination of elements and historical evolution that enables the earth to sustain life. We all carry the elements of the earth within us, and maybe it becomes a way of bringing us closer together, so that we begin to realize that we have to care for this planet, we have to be responsive to the creation, and we have to try to find the goodness therein. So maybe it could play out that way as well. Epiphany could become a time to remember our commonness, that we inhabit this earth and must care for it.
And then Epiphany becomes, let's say, in a wider sense, we talk about sort of a world epiphany, or a wider manifestation. And in Ephesians, I believe we see the terms that are used are Gentiles and Jews, and I believe that those were the broadest categories that really just signified the inclusiveness. And I think today we would be talking about the inclusive categories of men and women, rich and poor, Americans and non-Americans. That would all be another way of sort of using the Feast of Epiphany to point to, again, this global idea, or the whole idea of, that we're all connected with this, and that there's that the manifestation of God is one that would sort of beckon us to work toward greater world harmony, because of creation, because of our connectedness, because of wanting to be inclusive rather than exclusive.
I noticed that in that third chapter to Ephesians, the reading that's used on the Feast of the Epiphany, it says that, talks about God's secret plan. There's been a secret plan sort of being unfolded throughout all of history, and it's only gradually recognized by people. And the secret plan is to bring people together, to overcome the divisions, and to make sure that all the humans are seen as members of the same body. I'm using it in the way you suggested, that Gentiles and Jews become symbolic of all the people who are disparate, who see life differently, or who have a history of division and now need to be brought together. So it seems like that this idea of the secret plan is good, and part of the secret plan is that there is a whole creative drive, that the whole of creation groans until it shares in the victory of the sons and daughters of God, that we're part of a cosmic process, and that we really have responsibilities to move that forward. And part of the ways we move it forward is to tend to the creation and to see the way it manifests God to us. So again, the star becomes one symbol of this secret plan that God has, that is very inclusive, as you well said. So, Geraldine, we have this Feast of the Epiphany here, and trying to search out what it begins to tell us about life and so on. I'd like to return to that personal epiphany idea again, if you're in tune with that. Are you in that wavelength there? Because
sure.
I was thinking, just the very question. I mean, I wonder how much nature functions as catalyst for personal epiphany for people. In other words, how many people look at trees and some somehow are moved to prayer or look up in the starry night and have some religious sense that we're dependent upon a larger power. I wonder if people who live in urbanized environments and city dwellers and so on have much of a sense of nature anymore. Do you have a feel for that kind of question? Or
I do, and my experience is one that it's a positive response. Again, whether I don't know what labels people are using, if they're talking about it as prayer or Christian, but I've really yet to know a person who, when they deliberately observe nature, regardless of what season it is, and they take the time to do that, that does not have some kind of an experience of something broader than themselves. And I think that's why we are at times driven to that. I think about people who love mountains and people who love to go to the lake, and just what that means, and how just being in that atmosphere can change, one's mode of approach. I know of several people, myself included, a good place for me to relax and kind of get refocused is just to be somewhere near a lake. And either I'm hanging around with those kinds of people, or I guess people do tell me about that similar thing happens.
Mm-hmm.
Either it's a lake, or it's, for you, probably be a golf course. You like the trees and the whatever.
Yes, if my golf game is in reasonable shape, it could lead me to prayer. And when it's really bad, which is the usual case, it leads me to other kind of thoughts at
But
times.
do you see the trees on the golf course, and do you see the beauty on the golf course?
Sometimes, Geraldine, I try to do that. I really do. And I usually do it after a series of 5 bad shots in a row as a way of controlling myself. But seriously, I do try to do that. And I play golf with some people who are much more attuned to that than I am. But I am usually so concentrated on the game that I'm afraid it doesn't work that way for me. I can step back afterwards and say it's a beautiful scenic hole or something, or stepping up to the tee, maybe one of my golfing partners will say, well, that is a beautiful vista here, a marvelous setting, and that helps me a little bit. So, yeah, it can happen, and maybe as a result of your comments, I'll try to do it more in the future. It might even help my golf game. Who knows? That's probably more than you wanted to hear about golf, but go ahead. What was your point that you were trying to make?
Well, I think I just landed on the wrong wrong example, but the idea was, what does happen to us when we're in the context of nature, and I suspect, it might be a fall tree, or it might be water, it might be the mountains, or it might just be waking up on a morning where the snow has fallen for the first time. And, when you hear people talk in their everyday language, sometimes we say, well, it's a glib thing that we talk about the weather, but sometimes I think we need to challenge people and go further than that. When just a couple days ago, when it had snowed rather gently and softly in the morning, and people were talking about the weather, and to pursue that and say, now, really, wasn't that beautiful? And I think those conversations do come, and that... So I guess I think, and maybe it's naive or whatever, but I cannot understand how someone could not be touched by nature.
Mm-hmm. So I noticed one of the comments you made earlier, that you seldom saw anyone who, if they really were... it was pointed out to them or encouraged to look, or they really encounter nature, that they would not be moved. Your experience is that it does work that way. I tend to think that same way. But oftentimes we who live in the cities or are surrounded by technology and so on probably need that boost. Or maybe that's why people like to go camping these days and get away from it all and get out and commune with nature. It's interesting. It's a euphemism often used for golf, is to commune with nature, an opportunity to do that. So, anyway, I believe that it does have that power. I was thinking, Geraldine, as you were talking earlier on about one of the problem areas with this is, you said it so well that nature should open up a sense of mystery and, looking at the stars. I was thinking how astrology undercuts that. The whole idea of astrology that we associate with the wise men here is that the idea that somehow you're going to learn how to control the world, that by looking at the stars you can predict what's going to happen. It seems to me to be exactly the opposite of opening up the sense of mystery that I'd like to see with nature. In other words, to open up the unknown future and the beauties and majesty and grandeur of God, rather than using it to predict in an obviously unscientific way what's going to happen to one throughout the day, or however people use the astrology. I think that it undercuts what I would like to see as the real meaning of Epiphany here.
Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I guess maybe I think that's true, but the other element to that is when, and I'm not talking about people, I sometimes at night will read the astrological forecast in a sort of light-hearted manner to see if I want to get up the next day to see what it does have to say, if it will be good or if it will be bad. That's kind of light-hearted, but without being a strict astrologer, believing that, I think the good point about it is that it does point to people who want to believe in a higher being, and it does have that to offer, and that again, I think that while astrology, I remember talking to an astrologer, and her conversation to me was then, it's nothing more than what you believe in terms of your tradition of God. So while I think some do look at it in the way you're suggesting, the way I like to look at those people is that their need for a higher being.
And that there's a God who has ordered the world,
right,
and one is able to discern that ordering and so on. I suppose the scientific community would want to pick up on that in a more modern way and say that their study of the stars and study of the general cosmos that God has created reveals to them a sense of mystery. That's what Einstein said, of course, that there was a sense of awe and wonder and mystery that arose as one looked carefully at this world of ours. So I find within the world of science a real effort to uncover that. It's sort of a new wave within the scientific community, which I welcome and I think is really a good addition. Well, Geraldine, we've been talking about the Feast of the Epiphany. It's a major feast, especially in the Eastern Church, and the gospel story is about the wise men who come from the east, and they follow the star. And we begin to reflect on that, and we remember that creation is supposed to reveal God to us, and it does because God is the author of creation. He's given us this whole dynamic process. We're responsible for furthering it, and if we attune ourselves and really open up our mind and heart, then nature can speak to us of the great Lord and really bring us to a more prayerful consideration of who we are and where we fit in this great cosmos of ours.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Sister Geraldine Nowak, who is a pastoral associate at St. Ignatius Church in Oregon, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections was the Feast of the Epiphany, creation revealing its maker. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.